17 horrifying cases, 7 levels of inhumanity, all in one disturbing Iceberg video. Today we are delving into the darkest depths of London, England. And, honestly, I don't think the tourist board will be too happy with me after they watch this one. We start off dark and we only get darker the further down the iceberg we go. And now it's time to dive in. Love ya. On the evening of the 19th of August 2004, 22-year-old Amélie Delagrange met several French friends for drinks at Crystal's Wine Bar in Twickenham. She had moved to London only a few months earlier, hoping to improve her English while working at a bakery in Richmond. Her family remembered her as happy, intelligent and cautious, and she was already considering extending her stay in Britain. At around 8:30 p.m, Amélie called her boyfriend, Olivier L'Enfant, and invited him to join the group. He was busy moving house and declined, but they agreed to meet the following day. Amélie assured him that she would not be home late. Shortly after 9:30, CCTV captured her boarding a number 267 bus outside the Old Post Sorting House pub on London Road. It was a journey she had taken before, but that night Amélie missed her usual stop. The bus continued until she got off in Fulwell, leaving her further from home than she had intended. Realising her mistake, she began walking back through the dark towards Twickenham Green. While Amélie tried to find her way home, Levi Belfield was driving through the same streets in a Ford Courier van. Belfield was a former pub bouncer and wheel clamper who spent long periods driving around southwest London. Investigators would eventually establish that he repeatedly watched women around bus routes and bus stops, sometimes approaching them from his vehicle. He knew the local streets, the quiet corners, and the places where someone leaving a late bus might suddenly find herself alone. CCTV showed Belfield's van moving around Twickenham before Amélie reached the green. Amélie was last seen alive at around 10 p.m. walking by herself. One local resident later recalled hearing a woman's voice and a brief scream coming from the darkness. At approximately 10:30, a student found Amélie lying face down near the cricket square on Twickenham Green. She had suffered severe head injuries. The student placed her in the recovery position and ran to find help. But Amélie's time on this earth ended in hospital shortly after midnight. Her handbag, telephones, purse and keys were missing. The route Belfield took afterwards contained a gap of approximately 26 minutes. Prosecutors argued that he used that time to drive to Walton Bridge and dispose of Amélie's belongings in the River Thames. Divers later recovered several of the items from the water. Telephone records, CCTV and the movements of his van helped place him in the area surrounding Amélie's final journey. The attack was not examined in isolation. 18 months earlier, 19-year-old Marsha McDonnell had been attacked close to her home in Hampton, shortly after stepping off the number 111 bus. In May 2004, 18-year-old Kate Sheedy had also just left a London bus when Belfield deliberately drove into her. Kate survived and later gave evidence against him. Those cases revealed the importance of the bus network to Belfield's pattern. He did not simply choose random London streets. He watched routes, followed passengers and looked for young women, becoming separated from the safety of a crowded bus. Belfield was eventually convicted of Amélie and Marsha's murder, as well as the attempted murder of Kate. He was later convicted of ending Millie Dowler and received whole life prison sentences. Millie's story was the first ever case I covered on this channel 4 years ago. It's one of those stories that stayed with me since it first showed up in the news, and it's still there nearly 25 years later. On the 27th of April 2018, 91-year-old Sir Robert Malpass was making an ordinary journey through central London. The retired industrialist had once helped lead some of Britain's largest companies, serving as a managing director of BP and later as co-chairman of Eurotunnel. That afternoon, however, he was simply returning from a pensioner's lunch, travelling with his Freedom Pass and heading towards the Central Line. Sir Robert walked along the platform at Marble Arch, wearing a brown Burberry raincoat over a suit and tie. He carried an umbrella and had no reason to pay attention to the man approaching from behind him. That man was Paul Crossley. Only minutes earlier, Crossley had been at Tottenham Court Road Station, where he had suddenly tried to force another passenger, Tobias French, towards the tracks as a train arrived. Tobias was a professional sportsman, and his balance may have saved him. He resisted the attack, remained on the platform, and escaped what could easily have become a fatal fall. Crossley fled and continued through the underground. At Marble Arch, CCTV recorded him, noticing Sir Robert and moving directly towards him. Without warning, he placed both hands against the elderly man's back and pushed. His pelvis was fractured, his head struck the track, and his umbrella fell beside him. The next train was due in approximately 1 minute. People on the platform screamed, but one man immediately began running. Teacher Riyad El-Hassani covered roughly 20 meters before jumping down onto the tracks. As he landed, his hand briefly touched an electrified rail, leaving him with a burn. He continued anyway, reaching Sir Robert and moving him towards the platform edge. Other passengers leaned down and helped pull the injured man back to safety. Sir Robert spent more than a week in hospital. The wound on his head required 12 stitches, and the fractured pelvis left him facing a long recovery. Riyad's intervention had taken only moments, but without it, British Transport Police believed the case could have become part of a double fatality investigation. Members of the public chased and restrained Crossley after the attack. Investigators learned that he had paranoid schizophrenia, had not taken his medication that day, and had used approximately £600 worth of illicit stimulants the previous day. He said he had become paranoid and had heard voices, but the judge concluded that substance use and aggression, rather than schizophrenia alone, had driven the attacks. Crossley was convicted of attempting to end the lives of both Sir Robert and Tobias. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 12 years, initially to be served in hospital before transfer to prison. Sir Robert eventually recovered enough to walk and resume his normal affairs. He lived for another 5 years, dying in June 2023 at the age of 95. The CCTV remains disturbing, but it also captured something else, a selfless act from a perfect stranger. Amy Parsons had spent years building a life in London. Originally from Melbourne, the 35-year-old had moved to the UK and established a successful career in the city. Friends described her as adventurous, intelligent, kind and grounded. She lived in Whitechapel with her fiancé Roderick Deakin White, and from the outside their relationship looked settled. They had been together for around 8 years, appeared frequently in photographs together, and had even discussed marriage. Behind closed doors, however, Amy was becoming increasingly unhappy. Deakin White worked intermittently as a graphic designer and relied heavily on Amy's financial support. One source of tension was his interest in cross-dressing, something Amy had grown uncomfortable with, particularly because he often wanted to incorporate it into their intimate life. But that was only one part of a relationship that had begun to deteriorate. By early 2018, Amy had grown closer to a colleague named James Saunders. What started with coffees eventually developed into a romantic relationship. Amy began talking openly about leaving Deakin White and moving on. As she started pulling away, his behavior became increasingly controlling. He accessed her laptop, monitored her taxi account, and followed her home from work. In messages to friends, he agonized over the possibility of losing her and repeatedly asked what he could do to keep the relationship alive. Some of those messages were darker. To one person he wrote, "I hate her." In another message he said, "I'm going to do something stupid. I just know it." Amy, meanwhile, appeared to have made her decision. The night before her death, she stayed with James. They had already told each other that they loved one another, and Amy made clear that she intended to end her engagement. On the 25th of April 2018, Amy returned to the 5th floor flat that she shared with Deakin White in Whitechapel. Earlier that day, she had told a friend that she needed to resolve the situation. That evening, she began messaging James as the conversation with her fiancé unfolded. "I don't know how tonight is going to pan out," she wrote. "He's not accepting anything I say." Deakin White was promising changes and making what Amy described as grand gestures, trying to persuade her to stay. Her response was clear. She did not want the relationship to continue. She added that he was not backing off. At some point during the argument, Deacon White left the flat. Amy continued messaging James, and her final message to him was a heart emoji. At 8:13 p.m., Deacon White returned. Amy was in the shower. Near the front door was a metal exercise bar that was normally kept in the flat. As protection against a possible break-in, Deacon White picked it up and entered the bathroom. He then launched a sustained attack, while Amy was standing in the bath beneath the shower. The force caused catastrophic injuries to her head and face. Deacon White later admitted that he had continued until he believed she was no longer alive. Then he left her there. Forensic evidence suggested Amy may have survived for more than 30 minutes after the attack, possibly close to an hour. Deacon White did not call an ambulance. Instead, he turned off the bathroom light, covered his clothing, set the burglar alarm, and locked the door behind him. He then disposed of their phones in the River Thames. During the period after the attack, he went to a man living on a houseboat and confessed that he had killed his fiancée. He also telephoned his father and described himself as a murderer. His father contacted emergency services and asked police to check on Amy. Officers eventually forced their way into the Whitechapel flat, where Amy was found in the bathroom. Her time on this earth had ended from a traumatic brain injury. Deacon White eventually handed himself in. There was never any dispute that he had caused Amy's death. The central argument became what he had intended when he entered the bathroom with the metal bar. He denied murder and claimed the killing had been an accident, or that he had lost control. The prosecution argued that this could not be separated from what had come before it. Amy was trying to leave. Deacon White had monitored her movements, followed her, interfered with her communications, and expressed increasing anger as he realized the relationship was ending. Detective Inspector Darren Jones later said Amy had begun taking steps towards a life free from Deacon White's controlling behavior, and that he could not accept she was moving on. A jury agreed. In November 2019, Roderick Deacon White was convicted of murder. At sentencing, Judge John Lafferty described Amy's death as a horrendous and brutal killing before reducing the case to its central point. Deacon White had decided that if he could not have Amy, nobody else would. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 17 years. Amy's family were deeply disappointed by that minimum and said they intended to appeal it. Her sister Eve described Amy as the bright light of their family. What makes the case especially difficult is how clearly Amy had already begun moving towards another life. She had made the decision to leave, told friends, started another relationship, and returned home specifically to end the old one. In her final messages, the question was no longer whether Amy wanted to leave Roderick Deacon White. It was whether he was willing to accept that she had. Every day, millions of people step onto London buses and place a kind of automatic trust in the person behind the wheel. The driver controls a large vehicle through crowded streets, carries children, commuters and elderly passengers, and comes into contact with thousands of strangers over the course of a career. Most people never think twice about who is sitting in that cab. For years, Keith Betterson was one of those drivers. He worked for Transport for London and lived in Chessington with his Hungarian-born wife, Ildiko Betterson. She was 25 years younger than Keith, and people close to the couple said that she once idolized her husband and would do almost anything for him. By 2019, however, the relationship had begun to change. Ildiko reported a physical confrontation to police, but later withdrew the complaint. Their daughter had pointed out that Keith was the family's main source of income, placing Ildiko in the difficult position of depending financially upon the same man she had reported. The following year, Keith reversed a bus into something while working. He left his job in June 2020 before he could be dismissed. Almost immediately, the structure surrounding the couple disappeared. Keith was no longer working. The country was moving through pandemic restrictions, and he and Ildiko were spending far more time together inside their home. Both began drinking heavily. Arguments became frequent enough for their neighbour Debbie May to hear them through the thin walls. Debbie recalled Keith tormenting Ildiko by copying her voice in a high-pitched Punch and Judy style. He also insulted her appearance. On the 26th of October 2020, Ildiko showed Debbie a black eye and said that Keith had struck her. 5 days later, on the night before Halloween, Ildiko arrived at Debbie's doorstep wearing only a small nightdress and carrying a gin and tonic. She showed her bruises across her arms and legs, and again indicated that her husband was responsible. Despite what she had just revealed, Ildiko returned home at around 11:30 p.m. Approximately 90 minutes later, Keith telephoned their daughter. He repeatedly told her that he had ended her mother's life and said he could not take any more. He then called 999 and reported that the couple had fought and that Ildiko was no longer responding. Police and paramedics found her collapsed on the bed. She had suffered facial injuries and sustained pressure to both sides of her neck. Although emergency workers tried to save her, her time on this earth had already ended. Keith initially made blunt admissions at the house, but later claimed that Ildiko's death had been an accident, or that he had acted in self-defense. He said he had held her throat only briefly after she accused him of having an affair. The physical evidence did not support that account. Prosecutors argued that he had restrained her from behind for between 15 and 30 seconds. A jury found him guilty of murder, and in February 2022 he received a life sentence, with a minimum term of 14 years. The investigation then exposed another side of the former bus driver. 3 victims came forward describing serious maltreatment committed over several years, including offences against a girl who was not 18. Keith was subsequently convicted of 6 further offences and received an additional 9-year sentence. For years he had occupied a position associated with public trust, carrying countless people safely across London. The passengers could see the uniform and the man controlling the bus, but what they couldn't see was who he was when he went home. On the night of the 27th of August 2016, 30-year-old Oliver Dearlove went out in Blackheath with friends from the University of Portsmouth. It was a reunion of sorts with football, drinks and good food. Oliver, known as Ollie to his friends, had built a stable life, a good life. He worked as a relationship manager at Duncan Laurie Bank in Victoria, having previously worked for Coutts and Barclays Wealth Management. He lived in New Eltham with his long-term girlfriend, Claire Wheatley, and the couple were saving for a house and talking seriously about marriage and children. Shortly after midnight, Oliver and his friends left a bar and waited for a pre-booked taxi on Tranquil Vale. Nearby, a group of women were also heading home after celebrating a birthday. One had taken off her heels because her feet were hurting. Oliver started chatting to her, asking if she was all right. She mentioned that it was her first night out after having a baby, showed him photographs and received a simple compliment. Witnesses remembered Oliver as polite. Then, Trevor Timon approached. Trevor knew the women and had been drinking with them earlier. For reasons that were never fully justified by anything Oliver had done, his mood turned aggressive. He demanded to know what the men were talking about and began challenging them. Oliver's friend Andrew Cook remembered Trevor appearing angry and looking for confrontation. At one point, Trevor warned Oliver that if he did not get out of his face, he would knock him out. Seconds later, he delivered a single left-handed punch to the side of Oliver's head. Oliver immediately fell. The force ruptured an artery and caused catastrophic bleeding around his brain. Friends rushed to help. A passing personal trainer stopped and performed CPR until paramedics arrived, and those efforts kept Oliver alive long enough for his family to reach the hospital. He never regained consciousness. His mother, Joy Wright, sat beside her firstborn son, held his hand, and spoke to him while he remained on life support. Claire was also able to say goodbye to the man she had expected to marry. Oliver's time on this earth ended the following evening. His killer was not looking to stick around to find out what justice awaited him. Trevor fled to Ireland before eventually returning and handing himself in. He claimed that he had reacted after hearing a racist remark made by one of Oliver's friends, although witnesses did not substantiate that account. He admitted manslaughter but denied intending serious harm. His history showed that violence was not unfamiliar to him. Previous incidents included threatening a bus driver while holding a golf club, punching a woman during an argument, and attempting to strike a barman after being refused entry to a pub. He was cleared of murder but convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 6 years in prison, with an additional 5 years on extended license, because he was considered a significant risk to the public. Oliver's family struggled with the sentence, and the case became remembered for something very sobering. One punch lasts less than a second, but it can end a life and destroy the future of an entire family.
Emergency location.
Clifton Suspension Bridge.
What's the emergency?
Right, we're going to need some police up here quite urgently, I think. We had a gentleman up here who was dragging a case behind him. The cases, the wheels are broken and what have you. He says there's car parts and what have you. It's got to be funny. The case is broken and it looks like it's really heavy and there's blood coming out of it. The guy with the case has run off. We're now with the case. It's blood. We're convinced it's blood.
Late on the evening of the 10th of July, 2024, people near the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol noticed a man struggling with two unusually heavy suitcases. At first it looked strange rather than sinister. A passerby even joked about the weight, asking whether there was a body inside. The man claimed he was carrying car parts. But when bridge staff approached and shone their torches towards the luggage, they noticed a thick, dark liquid leaking from one of the cases. He said it was oil. Then he abandoned both suitcases and ran. Police arrived, closed the bridge and opened the luggage. Inside were human remains belonging to two men. A label attached to one of the cases gave investigators the first clear route back through the mystery, an address in Shepherd's Bush, West London. The flat belonged to 62-year-old Albert Alfonso and 71-year-old Paul Longworth. When officers entered, they found the rest of both men concealed inside the property, including remains stored in a newly purchased chest freezer. The investigation now stretched from one of Bristol's most recognisable landmarks to a quiet London flat more than 100 miles away. The man who had fled the bridge was 35-year-old Justin Andres Mosquera, a Colombian national who had worked as an adult performer. He had known Albert for years through online material they both produced. Albert and Paul had previously invited him to stay in London, and they had also visited him in Colombia. In June 2024, Mosquera returned to Britain and moved into their flat. What initially appeared to be just another visit was apparently preparation for two planned killings. Mosquera began searching Facebook Marketplace for chest freezers before either man had died. He also searched online for information about where a blow to the head would prove fatal and researched tools that could be used to dispose of a body. These searches were not made after an unexpected confrontation. Paul was still alive while Mosquera was carrying them out. He had even been seen speaking to a neighbour through the flat window. During the early afternoon of the 8th of July, Paul disappeared from view. CCTV showed the curtains being closed and then reopened around half an hour later. It is believed that this was when Mosquera attacked him with a hammer. Paul's skull was shattered by repeated blows. His body was then hidden inside the storage compartment of a divan bed. Mosquera would later claim that it was actually Albert that had ended Paul, but employment records and CCTV proved Albert was at work when Paul's time on this earth ended. That single fact made Mosquera's explanation impossible and his account of the situation unreliable. Before Albert returned to the flat, Mosquera made further searches about how quickly a body begins to decompose. He also accessed the boarding pass for his planned return flight to Colombia. Albert came home later that evening. Cameras had been installed in his bedroom because he regularly recorded adult material. Those cameras captured what happened next. Mosquera had concealed a sharp implement beneath a cloth on a nearby table. During a filmed encounter, he suddenly used it against Albert repeatedly. The footage was so distressing that jurors were initially shown it without sound. Immediately afterwards, Mosquera began singing and dancing inside the flat. Financial activity followed almost at once. Mosquera accessed his computer and telephone. He found a spreadsheet containing financial information and attempted to transfer £4,000 into his own account in Colombia. He also left the property to withdraw money using Albert's bank cards. And then the next day, the chest freezer Mosquera had been searching for was delivered to the flat. He then began dismantling and concealing the evidence of what had happened. His next problem was disposal. Mosquera arranged for a stranger to transport him and the suitcases out of London on the 10th of July. The original destination was reportedly Brighton, but the journey was changed to Bristol. Why he selected the Clifton Suspension Bridge has never been fully understood. It was an extraordinary choice. The bridge had CCTV, security staff and high fencing along its length. Mosquera had carried 2 leaking, heavily loaded cases into one of the most visible public locations in the city. As we know, when questioned, he claimed they contained car parts. As soon as staff examined them more closely, he fled into nearby woodland. A cyclist attempted to follow him, while police deployed a helicopter and began a major search. Mosquera remained free for 3 days. On the 13th of July, officers found him outside Bristol Temple Meads railway station. He was arrested and returned to London to face 2 murder charges. At trial, Mosquera admitted causing Albert's death, but claimed that he had lost control because he believed that he was about to attack him. He denied killing Paul entirely and continued to blame Albert. The evidence, though, it dismantled both claims. This was not a sudden reaction followed by panic. Every stage showed preparation, concealment, and attempted financial gain. In July 2025, a jury found Mosquera guilty of murdering both Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso. He was later sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to serve a minimum of 40 years and 264 days before he could even be considered for release. The judge described the offences as premeditated and thoroughly wicked, adding that Mosquera might never be safe to release. Just a quick one. For some reason, my videos are normally seen by just 1 to 2% of my subscribers. I actually don't know why. Regardless of the reasons, it's making it extremely challenging to keep this show on the road, and I promise I don't like to do this. It makes me feel like Oliver Twist or something. But please do consider becoming a channel member. There are currently 343 of you, and I'm aiming for the crazy goal of 1,000 by the end of 2026. You get things like early access to videos, our behind-the-scenes podcast, and of course my eternal gratitude. Thank you, and I love you all. Now, back to the video. On the evening of the 29th of July 2005, 28-year-old Richard Whelan met his girlfriend, Kerry Barker, for drinks at the agricultural pub in North London. It was an ordinary Friday night. Afterward, they ran to catch the number 43 bus on Holloway Road and took seats on the upper deck. At almost the same moment, another passenger boarded, carrying a bag of chips. His name was Anthony Joseph, although he was also known as Anthony Pert. He had travelled to London from Manchester only hours earlier, following a release that should never have happened. Joseph had originally been arrested over a burglary in May. While on bail, he was detained again in connection with separate allegations and sent to the Forest Bank Young Offender Institution. The later charges were dropped, but an outstanding warrant remained active because he had missed a court appearance in the burglary case. Staff at Forest Bank did not have the correct information. At 1:45 that afternoon, Joseph was released. By around 10 p.m, he was sitting near the back of the bus's upper deck. He had consumed alcohol and other substances and was carrying a sharp implement. He began throwing chips at an American woman seated nearby, laughing as he did it. Uncomfortable with the behavior, she moved away. Joseph then began targeting Kerry. One of the chips struck the back of her head. Other passengers chose to go downstairs rather than become involved. Richard did not. Usually described as quiet and private, he stood and asked Joseph to stop. The confrontation lasted no more than 30 seconds. Joseph became verbally and physically aggressive. Kerry tried to pull him away from Richard while repeatedly pressing the bell and screaming for him to stop. During the struggle, Richard was struck 7 times across his thigh, back and torso, including once through the heart. Joseph ran downstairs and left the bus on Holloway Road. Witnesses remembered what appeared to be a smile or smirk on his face as he walked away. Richard initially tried to follow him. CCTV showed him making his way down the stairs while holding his chest, but his strength quickly failed. He collapsed and never regained consciousness. His time on this earth ended at Whittington Hospital, only hours after a peaceful evening had begun. The tragedy was made worse by the knowledge that Joseph should still have been in custody. A warrant had existed for his arrest, yet communication failures between police, courts, and the prison meant that the information did not reach the people responsible for his release. One computer system had not been updated. Different agencies in different parts of the country had failed to connect the cases. Joseph later admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility after 2 juries failed to reach a verdict on murder. He had paranoid schizophrenia and was sent indefinitely to Broadmoor Secure Hospital. An official inquiry strongly criticised the criminal justice system's handling of bail conditions, outstanding warrants, and communication between agencies. The report described parts of the process as lackadaisical and nonchalant, while recommending greater access to criminal records and closer cooperation between prisons, police, probation, and the courts. None of those reforms could change what happened on the upper deck. Richard had intervened because a stranger was throwing chips at women. The judge later called his reaction understandable and praiseworthy. He made a simple decision to protect someone else. And my question to you is, would you have stood up and intervened? Would you walk away? Or would you just pretend it wasn't happening? At 7:40 on the morning of the 5th of May 2017, commuters were crossing Putney Bridge when a runner appeared on the pavement. He wore a light grey t-shirt, dark shorts and trainers, moving towards a 33-year-old woman walking close to the road. As they passed, the runner extended his arm and shoved her sideways. She fell directly into the path of a red double-decker bus. Her head landed dangerously close to its wheels, leaving the driver, Oliver Salbris, almost no time to react. He swerved sharply into the next lane, avoiding her by inches. The runner never stopped. Passengers helped the woman from the road. She escaped with minor injuries, but was shaken and crying. Oliver got out, checked on her, and left his name, route number, and contact details. He later said turning the wheel had been pure reflex. Without it, the consequences would have been devastating for them both. What happened next made the incident even harder to wrap your head around, and a lot more infuriating. Around 15 minutes later, the same runner returned across the bridge. The woman tried to confront him, but he ignored her and continued north towards the River Thames. When police released the CCTV footage 3 months later, millions watched the brief encounter. The unidentified jogger became known as the Putney Pusher, and the clarity of the images created an expectation that he would quickly be found. Instead, the investigation stalled. More than 50 people were considered, and 3 men were arrested before being cleared and released without charge. One suspect proved he had been in the United States at the time. By June 2018, every available lead had been exhausted, and the inquiry was closed. For years, the footage remained one of London's most recognisable unsolved CCTV cases. It was discussed online, examined by amateur investigators, and eventually inspired a stage play, presenting the incident from the perspectives of the victim, the driver, and the runner. Then, 9 years after the push, new information reopened the trail. On the 15th of June 2026, police arrested a 44-year-old man at his £1.4 million home in West London on suspicion of attempted grievous bodily harm. He was a city banker. He was also arrested on suspicion of possessing Class A and Class B substances. The man was later released on bail while inquiries continued. For the first time in nearly a decade, the case was no longer entirely cold, although responsibility and, more importantly, justice was still up in the air. By the evening of the 5th of June 2020, 2 very different stories were unfolding on opposite sides of London. In Wembley, 46-year-old Bieber Henry was celebrating her birthday. Lockdown restrictions meant there would be no crowded nights out. So Bieber, her younger sister Nicole Smallman, and a small group of friends gathered instead in Friant Country Park. Bieber was a social worker who worked with vulnerable children and families. Nicole, 27, was a freelance photographer. They were close sisters, and that evening was supposed to be nothing more complicated than food, drinks, and time together. Across London, 18-year-old Daniel Hussein had become absorbed in something completely different. For around 2 years, Hussein had been active on an occult-themed internet forum called Becoming a Living God. He consumed material about demons, rituals, and supernatural agreements, and had become particularly interested in the idea that a person could make a pact with an entity in exchange for wealth or power. Hussein did not treat this simply as entertainment. Inside his bedroom, he produced a handwritten contract addressed to a demon called Lucifuge Rothakal. Following instructions he had encountered online, Hussein signed the document using his own blood. His offer was extraordinary. He promised to sacrifice 6 women every 6 months in exchange for financial rewards, including winning the Mega Millions lottery jackpot. There was another handwritten agreement, offering a blood sacrifice to a different demon in exchange for making a female student fall in love with him. While Hussein was preparing these supposed agreements, Bieber and Nicole were enjoying the birthday celebration. As midnight passed, their friends gradually began leaving the park. The sisters were having such a good time that they decided to remain behind. They switched on colourful fairy lights, played music, and continued dancing together in the field. At 1:05 a.m., Nicole messaged her boyfriend Adam Stone to tell him what they were doing. Photographs taken minutes later captured the sisters playing with the lights. One of the final images was taken at approximately 1:13 a.m. In it, both women appeared to be looking towards something outside the photograph. Prosecutors later noted the detail, although exactly what had attracted their attention could never be established. But we can make a good guess as to what they were looking at. At almost exactly the same time, Hussein was inside the same park. His preparation had become increasingly physical, rather than just mental during the preceding days. He had purchased a set of kitchen knives, ordered a black balaclava and folding shovels, created an online lottery account, and continued researching the occult material that formed the basis of his supposed pact. At around 7:45 that evening, CCTV captured Hussein leaving his family home. He travelled to Edgware Road to collect a package containing the balaclava and shovels, before continuing towards Friant Country Park. The two separate stories were now moving towards the same patch of darkness. Bieber and Nicole were alone after their friends left. Hussein had entered the park, believing that taking the lives of women would fulfill his supernatural agreement and eventually make him wealthy. Sometime after the sisters' final photographs and before 2:30 a.m., their paths converged. Hussein attacked Bieber first and then Nicole. Both sisters suffered repeated injuries from a sharp implement. During the confrontation, however, Hussein also badly injured his own hand. That mistake would become crucial. CCTV later captured him leaving the park at around 4 a.m. His trousers were missing, his jacket was wrapped around his waist, and his injured right hand was concealed against his body. When he eventually sought hospital treatment, Hussein claimed that he had been mugged. Meanwhile, Bieber and Nicole simply disappeared. When they failed to return home, their family contacted police. They were told resources would be deployed, but the response later came under serious criticism. Ultimately, relatives and friends went searching themselves. On the 7th of June, Adam Stone and others returned to Friant Country Park. They found the sisters' sunglasses and then a blood-stained sharp implement lying in the grass. Adam was still speaking to police when he pushed through vegetation beneath a tree line and discovered Bieber and Nicole. The investigation now began moving back towards Hussein. DNA left at the scene eventually produced a familial match to his father. On the 1st of July, officers raided the family home in Eltham. Inside Hussein's bedroom, they discovered the world he had been constructing around himself. There was, of course, the balaclava and shovel, but also a latex glove, occult symbols, lottery tickets, and the handwritten demonic contract. 3 lottery tickets had actually been folded inside the document, and Hussein had apparently expected the agreement to work. During the 10 days following the sisters' deaths, he spent more than £160, or around $200, on lottery tickets and online bets. Hilariously though, he won nothing. So he really was a loser in many definitions of the word. His own injury, CCTV movements, purchases, and DNA instead created an extensive evidential trail. In July 2021, a jury found Daniel Hussein guilty of both murders. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 35 years. Investigators believed his injured hand may have prevented the story from continuing. Because, remember, the pact found in his bedroom did not describe 2 victims. It described an intention to sacrifice 6 women every 6 months. On the night of the 8th of January 2024, 21-year-old Anajan Nanaswaran travelled to Strawberry Hill Station in southwest London for what was supposed to be a small transaction. 10 pills were to be exchanged for £50. It was an insignificant amount of money, but before the night was over, it would escalate to an unbelievable level. Anajan arrived at around 11 p.m, approximately an hour after Dino Donaldson and 3 other men had reached the station. A disagreement began between the 2 groups. As the atmosphere became more aggressive, Anajan called his brother, who came to the station with 2 friends. The arrival of more people did not calm the situation. Donaldson became increasingly confrontational and produced a long, sharp implement from his waistband. The argument became a chase, forcing members of the group away from the platform and down onto the railway tracks. Donaldson managed to catch up with Anajan. Anajan was struck in the chest, abdomen, and thigh. His brother immediately called 999 and began CPR beside the tracks, attempting to keep him alive until paramedics arrived. Despite those efforts, Anajan's time on this earth ended at the station. He was only 21. Donaldson fled through Twickenham towards Kingston upon Thames. CCTV allowed British Transport Police to follow his movements after he left Strawberry Hill, but the footage also captured something difficult to reconcile with what had just happened. Less than an hour after Anajan died, Donaldson boarded the N87 bus. The camera inside showed him smiling and laughing as he travelled away from the scene. A separate camera recorded his voice as he described the attack. Donaldson could be heard boasting, "I s***ed him fully," before explaining that he had felt the sharp implement enter Anajan's body. The recording gave investigators more than a route of escape. It captured Donaldson apparently describing the act in his own words. Potentially an admissible confession. Back at Strawberry Hill, officers searched the area surrounding the tracks. A sharp implement and a black glove had been concealed in a tree near the station. Forensic examination found DNA belonging to both Donaldson and Anajan on the recovered items. The trail led police to Donaldson's home in West London 3 days later. When officers entered on the 11th of January, they discovered him hiding inside a cupboard. A search of his bedroom also uncovered 74 wraps of illicit substances, valued at more than £1,000. Donaldson refused to accept responsibility, but the CCTV audio from the camera and forensic evidence constructed a sequence that was difficult for him to escape from. In April 2026, following a 2-week trial at the Old Bailey, a jury unanimously found him guilty of Anajan's murder. He was remanded in custody to await sentencing. The case began with £50 and 10 tablets, yet the person lost that night had already built a life extending far beyond the station. Anajan was in his 3rd year at university, studying accounting and finance. His family said he was excited about his future. He was also an accomplished athlete who held a first Dan black belt in karate and had competed at both world and European championships. His physical ability could not protect him from a concealed weapon on the railway tracks. Within minutes, a minor dispute had removed a much-loved son and brother from his family. On the evening of the 2nd of December 2006, 30-year-old Mark Blanco had dinner with friends in Wapping before returning to the George Tavern in East London. The pub manager remembered him as merry and in high spirits. He was preparing for a performance only 3 days away, and that night he believed he might have found the perfect person to invite. Mark was not simply an amateur actor drifting between London parties. He had studied philosophy at Trinity College, Cambridge, worked as a business consultant, and spent time at Goldman Sachs before deciding that the corporate world was not for him. He had lived in Paris, Australia, and Salamanca, collected antiquarian books, and performed close-up card magic. His mother, Sheila Blanco, described him as exuberant, generous, and intensely curious, with a love of literature and a refusal to tolerate people he considered foolish or dishonest. Mark had been cast as the central character in a production of Dario Fo's Accidental Death of an Anarchist at the George. The play was inspired by the real death of Giuseppe Pinelli, an Italian anarchist who fell from a police station window in 1969. That detail would later give the events of Mark's final night an unsettling resemblance to the play he was about to perform. At around 11:30, Mark heard that Pete Doherty was at a gathering nearby. Doherty was one of Britain's most recognisable musicians, known as the frontman of the Libertines and later Baby Shambles. His songs, public relationships and well-documented struggles with illegal substances had made him a constant presence in the British press. His background was very different from the chaotic image surrounding him by 2006. Doherty had been raised in a military family. His father, Peter, rose to the rank of Major in the Royal Signals. His mother, Jacqueline, had served in Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps before working as a registered nurse. The family moved between military bases during his childhood, but his increasing dependence on substances later placed enormous strain on those relationships. Mark was excited by the possibility of persuading Doherty to attend the play. Carrying a bottle of wine, he left the George and walked to the Whitechapel flat of Paul Roundhill. Roundhill was often described as Doherty's literary agent and was involved in selling artwork produced by the musician. His flat had been nicknamed the Hotel in the Sky and was widely known as a destination for heavy substance use. Although Roundhill has disputed some descriptions of the property, only 6 people were reportedly inside that night. CCTV recorded Mark arriving at approximately 12:13 in the morning. Doherty arrived 2 minutes later with his 19-year-old girlfriend, Kate Russell Pavier. Also present were Roundhill, Doherty's minder Johnny Geneval, known as Johnny Headlock, and 2 women named Annabelle Heald-Smith and Naomi Stirk. Mark had expected an opportunity to discuss his performance. Instead, the atmosphere became hostile. Accounts of the confrontation differ, but Roundhill has acknowledged striking Mark and dragging him from the flat. He also admitted pouring lighter fluid onto Mark's tweed cap and briefly setting it alight. Roundhill described the burning cap as an unconventional attempt at humour, intended to distract Mark and calm the situation. Sheila viewed it as part of a humiliating physical attack, in which her son's jacket was also torn. At approximately 12:25, Mark was forced from the flat. 2 minutes later, CCTV showed him returning to the building. Perhaps he wanted his belongings. Perhaps he wanted to finish the confrontation or dispute about what had been done to him. No recording captured his words, and the surviving witnesses have never provided a single undisputed account of what followed. Just 56 seconds after Mark re-entered the building, he somehow fell over the first-floor balcony. The fall was approximately 11 feet and 7 inches. CCTV captured Mark travelling backwards and outwards, but the balcony itself remained outside the camera's view. There was no footage showing whether he approached the railing voluntarily, lost his balance, or was accompanied by anyone else. He struck the street with catastrophic force. A neighbour named Paul Ellis heard shouting and looked through his window. He saw Mark lying in the gutter, a dark-haired woman screaming nearby, and another woman standing close to the scene. Ellis had basic first aid training, so he went outside, checked Mark's breathing, and covered him with his cardigan and jacket. The camera then recorded behaviour that would haunt Sheila for years. Pete Doherty came downstairs and approached Mark. Footage appeared to show him standing near or stepping over the critically injured man before running back inside. Roughly 15 seconds after Mark's fall, Doherty, Russell Pavier, and Headlock were seen leaving the building. Doherty has said he panicked because he was carrying illegal substances and feared being arrested. He later expressed regret for running away and has always denied having any involvement in Mark's fall. The emergency call was not received until approximately 12:43, around 14 minutes after Mark landed in the street. Doherty and girlfriend Russell Pavier left the area in a taxi before paramedics arrived at 12:57. Mark reached the Royal London Hospital at approximately 1:17. His head injuries were too severe, and he died in the early hours of the 4th of December. Doherty continued to a hotel in Clerkenwell. At 2:25 that morning, police were called following reports that he had disrupted a wedding gathering, damaged hotel property, and become involved in a disturbance. He had reportedly left before officers arrived. The initial explanation for Mark's death was that he had either fallen accidentally or deliberately jumped. Sheila rejected both possibilities. Her son had suffered from extreme vertigo. She said he avoided exposed heights and would never willingly have approached the edge of a balcony. He had also been happy only hours earlier, had a performance scheduled, and had entered the flat specifically to invite Doherty to attend. The subject of that play complicated the case further. Roundhill eventually suggested that Mark may have jumped as a theatrical or creative statement connected to the play, The Accidental Death of an Anarchist. Doherty later expressed a similar view, saying Mark was alone and had either fallen or been attempting to make an extreme point about art imitating life. The coroner ruled out that Mark did this on purpose and returned an open verdict. By then, Sheila had already begun identifying failures in the original investigation. The day after the fall, she visited the street and found a lens from Mark's glasses still lying in the gutter. His glasses and his watch, specifically an £800 Tag Heuer, were initially missing from the possessions that were returned. A police officer had reportedly placed them in a locker before going on leave and had simply forgotten that they existed. Mark's clothing was never subjected to the comprehensive forensic examination Sheila believed it required. 3 weeks after the death, on Christmas morning, Johnny Geneval, or Headlock, walked into Bethnal Green Police Station and confessed to killing Mark.
I phoned the police and I just said to them, yeah, I killed him, but I don't know why. I got in the cell and I was lying down, I was thinking, somewhere to sleep at night. And then I was lying down, I was thinking, hold on, man, I've opened a can of worms here. Because it was just sort of dying down, I think. And I thought, no, man. And then I just started knocking on the door. I said, no, can you let me out, man? I didn't really do it.
He withdrew the statement hours later, explaining that public accusations and stress had become overwhelming. He subsequently denied responsibility, including directly to Sheila. The confession did not resolve the case, but it became another piece of information that Sheila believed had not been handled properly. Police re-investigated, yet prosecutors concluded there was not enough evidence to prove that Mark had been pushed, thrown, or dropped. Crucially, they could not establish that another person had been on the balcony with him at the moment he fell. Independent specialists hired by the family later examined the footage and Mark's injuries. Professor Richard Wassersuk concluded that two of the most likely explanations were that Mark had been backed against the railing and pushed, or that he was already unconscious and was dropped over it. Forensic video expert John Kennedy noted that Mark displayed no visible defensive movement during the fall. Grant Fredericks, who taught at the FBI National Academy, said the footage was consistent with a person being carried and released over the balcony edge. Those findings challenged the idea of a simple accident, but they could not identify who might have carried out such an act. Doherty, Roundhill, Headlock and the other guests have denied responsibility, and no one has been charged. There were other disturbing details surrounding the location. 5 years earlier, Irish musician Paul Cuniff had also died after a fall connected with the same flat. The circumstances of that incident were never fully established, and its existence does not prove any connection to Mark's death. It did, however, deepen the unease surrounding the building. Sheila has now spent almost 2 decades reconstructing a period lasting little more than an hour. She has collected statements, commissioned analysis, challenged police decisions, and pursued fresh reviews. New material has since been presented to the City of London Police, while a victim's right to review process has examined the decision not to prosecute. The central sequence is remarkably short, with perhaps the most important moment lasting just 56 seconds. I would definitely love to hear your thoughts on this one, so just drop a comment below and we can talk it out. In May 2024, 50-year-old Angeline Mahal was living in Hornchurch, East London, with 2 XL bully dogs named Bella and SJ. She had owned them since they were puppies and, according to her family, treated them almost like children. Her brother Gurinder remembered her as an animal lover who would leave family gatherings early because she wanted to get home to feed or walk them. Angeline knew SJ could be difficult with Bella, But there was no indication that she believed either dog posed a serious danger to her. Her family, though, they had been worrying. Only 3 months earlier, 68-year-old Esther Martin had died after being attacked by 2 XL bullies in Essex. Gurinder said relatives had specifically referred to that case when they urged Angeline to get rid of her dogs. They did not want the same thing to happen to her. But, of course, Angeline kept them. On the evening of the 19th of May, she returned home from a party in an Uber at around 10 p.m. Her twin sons were out, leaving her alone with Bella and SJ. At some point during the night, a neighbor heard a disturbance and contacted police. Unfortunately, officers were given the wrong location. A police van attended the address they had been provided, found nothing, and left. So Angeline remained inside her home. At around 1 p.m. the following day, her sons returned. They found their mother unresponsive on the floor, with injuries to her arms and legs. The dogs had been secured in separate rooms. Emergency services arrived, but Angeline's time on this earth had already ended. A post-mortem later confirmed that she had suffered multiple bite injuries. The coroner concluded that her death was accidental. What made the case especially significant was its timing. Only months earlier, new legislation had come into force, making it illegal in England and Wales to own an XL bully without an exemption certificate. Existing dogs had to be registered, microchipped and neutered, while owners were required to keep them muzzled and on a lead in public. Angeline's dogs had reportedly been registered under those rules. Her death, therefore, exposed a difficult limitation in the debate around dangerous dogs. Regulation can control where an animal is taken, who is allowed to own it, and how it behaves in public. But it cannot guarantee what happens inside a private home. Other fatal attacks had already fueled the wider concern. Jack Liz passed in 2021. Shirley Patrick passed after an attack in 2022. Jonathan Hogg was fatally injured in 2023. And of course, Esther Martin died only months before Angeline. Those cases helped drive a change in the law. But Angeline's story brings the question, does the law go far enough? Where does public safety end and government overreach begin? Please do share your thoughts in the comments. In January 2016, 20-year-old Sophie Lyonnais left the French city of Troyes and moved to London to work as an au pair. For Sophie, the arrangement should have been a chance to become more independent, improve her English and gain experience working with children. Friends and relatives described her as shy, gentle and particularly caring. She loved animals, wanted to work with children, and was not someone naturally inclined towards confrontation. Her new employers were Sabrina Koida and Wissem Medouni, a French couple living in Southfields, southwest London. At first, the arrangement appeared to work. Sophie looked after the children, made friends with other local nannies, and seemed happy enough when she spoke to her mother. Sabrina sometimes sat with her over cups of tea and even gave her a makeover. But inside the house on Wimbledon Park Road, something gradually changed. Sabrina had developed an extraordinary fixation on her former boyfriend, Mark Walton, a founding member of Boyzone, who by then lived in Los Angeles and worked in the music industry. Their relationship had ended years earlier, but Sabrina continued making allegations against the pop star. She accused Walton of using black magic against her. She claimed he had arranged helicopters to fly above her house. On one occasion, she even accused him of seriously violating a cat, despite evidence being given at trial that she did not own one. Eventually, Sophie became incorporated into this belief system. Sabrina became convinced that her young au pair was secretly working with Walton. Sophie was accused of sleeping with him, spying on the family, and helping him enter the house so that its occupants could be drugged and seriously violated. There was one enormous problem. Sophie had never met Mark Walton. But inside the Southfields house, facts were becoming increasingly irrelevant. Medouni began participating in Sabrina's accusations. Prosecutors later described the couple as a truly toxic combination, with their shared suspicions, creating a closed world in which Sophie became responsible for events that had never happened. The interrogations became relentless. Hours of recordings recovered from their phones captured Sophie being questioned repeatedly about Walton. She was called a spy and a pedophile. She was threatened with prison, further violence and serious violation unless she admitted what the couple wanted to hear. At first, Sophie denied everything. Eventually, she began saying what they demanded. By then, people who encountered her locally had noticed a change. Michael Cromer, who ran a nearby fish and chip restaurant, remembered Sophie becoming increasingly withdrawn. Sometimes she appeared close to tears. On one occasion, she told him Sabrina had struck her because she had dropped some butter. Her mother, Catherine, also realized that something was wrong. By April 2017, Sophie was telling her family she wanted to return to France. Her mother bought her a plane ticket. Investigators would later be unable to find either that ticket or Sophie's passport inside the house. A recorded telephone conversation captured Catherine pleading for her daughter to come home. Sabrina refused to let the matter end, insisting Sophie first had to reveal where she had supposedly been with Walton. It became the last conversation Sophie ever had with her mother. During her final weeks, Sophie's condition deteriorated dramatically. Recordings showed her becoming increasingly thin, frightened, and quiet. For the final 12 days of her life, she was reportedly prevented from leaving the house. On the 18th of September 2017, the husband and wife recorded what they presented as a breakthrough. An exhausted Sophie finally appeared to confess to their accusations. Prosecutors argued that the words had no evidential value whatsoever. After months of intimidation, violence, and interrogation, Sophie was simply telling her captors what they demanded to hear. Within hours, though, tragically, she was dead. Exactly how her time on this earth ended could never be established because of what happened afterwards. Post-mortem examinations did reveal extensive injuries, including fractures to her jaw, sternum, and ribs. The possible causes of death included a serious head injury, choking, or drowning. Rather than call emergency services, Sabrina and Maduni began planning how to make Sophie disappear. They placed her remains in a suitcase and decided to burn them in the back garden. On the 20th of September, neighbors became concerned about a foul-smelling fire behind the house and contacted emergency services. Firefighters arrived to find the couple apparently behaving normally beside the flames, even cooking chicken nearby. Once the fire had been brought under control, firefighter Thomas Hunt began examining what remained. He saw what appeared to be human fingers and a nose. When Maduni was asked what they'd been burning, he claimed it was a sheep carcass bought at Wimbledon Market. It was not. Among the ashes were Sophie's clothing, jewellery, and human remains. The couple had intended to claim that their au pair had simply left their employment and returned to France. Instead, the fire designed to erase Sophie had drawn neighbours, firefighters, and eventually murder detectives directly to the house. Sabrina and Maduni admitted attempting to dispose of Sophie's remains, but each blamed the other for her death. The jury rejected them both. In May 2018, Sabrina Kouida and Wissem Maduni were convicted of murdering Sophie Lyonnais. Each received a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. At sentencing, the judge described the suffering inflicted on Sophie as prolonged and without pity. A truly bizarre case.